Hi game developers, Chris DeLeon here of GamKeto. Let's talk about how sometimes it's right to be at least a little bit wrong. Or another way to put it, how to sometimes look at imperfection as a strategic advantage. Now, the first thing I'm going to use to set this up, I want to share a short clip from a show I loved as a kid. This is now a 22-year-old episode, so pardon for my younger viewers. But this is Adventures of Pete and Pete. This episode's called Inspector 34, and young Pete Wrigley here on the right looked up who was the inspector of his underwear, because his underwear had always been perfect for years. And it always had a tag that said Inspector 34 did it. So he meets this guy and discovers he's a total perfectionist in every area of his life, right? He just does everything by the book, says all the right answers, is the perfect, just step-by-step approach to everything. And so Pete Wrigley's family challenges him to eat barbecue chicken out at a picnic table. Just as, the ultimate challenge of can he do this and not make a mess? And sure enough, he does. Nothing gets on his mouth, nothing gets on his face, nothing gets on the plate. He doesn't even need to use a napkin. And that's kind of the problem. Because that's not the right way to eat barbecue chicken at a picnic table, right? That is totally the wrong way to go about it. He's emphasizing the wrong things to think that this is the best or right way to eat barbecue chicken. Now, I know it's a little bit silly, but to pull it back to our game development stuff, this is something that in every area of what we do, whether you're a beginner, whether you've been doing this for a while, let me start with beginner level, right? So codeyourfirstgame.com, my video course, by the time of this video, has now had about 26,000 people around the world take it, which I'm proud to say 94% of the people who've taken that course have had positive responses, 4 or 5 star reviews. Now, if you look at some of the 1-star reviews, though, that 1% of negative reviews I'm getting, they're occasionally they're from sometimes senior programmers who will complain that there's shorter ways to write this code, right? Or that this is not well architected, this is not well engineered, this is not advanced techniques, that these are beginner techniques. To which, of course, they are. This is a beginner course. The course is made for beginners. And I think it's incredibly important for beginners to be taught and allowed to use and feel comfortable with beginner techniques, right? It'd be like stomping into a first grade classroom and, you see that they've written 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 instead of 2 times 4. And you're like, oh, no, you're doing it wrong. You should write 2 times 4. They're not familiar with the concept yet. And until they're familiar with 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2, they have no concept for why it would save them time or energy to use a multiplication sign. And obviously the same extrapolates for older students with exponents or all kinds of other mathematical concepts that save us time and energy doing things we understand the foundations of before we're doing them. Now, another area where this idea of embracing imperfection has been a huge central key part of my own experience in game development is in my personal gameography. So at chrisdeleon.com, you can see games I've worked on. I've released about 125 games by now. Various sizes and scales and team sizes and so on. And I'll be the first to say, I'm happy to admit, there are lots of imperfections among my games that I've worked on. Some have placeholder art that made it into the final version. Some have bugs. Some don't work on certain operating system configurations. Some are just all around imperfect. Some didn't come out that great. Some weren't that fun, right? But along the way, it was because of that imperfection, because of accepting it, that enabled me to then dabble in, get experience in such a wide variety of genres and explore such a tremendous volume of ideas that I couldn't have if I had been trying to hang on for dear life for this one game has to be perfect. For that this one game has to come out in every line, well written, well engineered, cleaned up, that all the art has to wind up just so, a really restrictive kind of way of thinking about it. Now, out of all those projects, many of them, that was really the only level of investment of energy it deserved. Few hours a week for a few months or whatever to make that game happen, to release it and move on with my life. Now, some of the other ones did very well. Reached millions of players, paid my rent for a year and a half, made some other company, not me, millions and millions of dollars, right? These are things that only happen when you allow yourself this outlet of being able to just imperfectly make mistakes, try things, explore ideas with a low level of investment. And when I talk about using imperfection as a strategy, you can think of it a bit as a dial or a slider, right? Where it's not like it's one or the other. It's not that it's all perfectly clean and well engineered or it's all just total slop hacky fest. There's a range in the middle in which you're balancing it with other things in your life. You're balancing it with your job obligations, your school obligations. You're balancing it with your time with your social people, your friends and your family, with your personal health, with other things going on in your life. And when you look at it that way, it becomes, again, in many cases, entirely appropriate, a bit like our barbecue eating Inspector 34, to have a little bit of mess to it. that can be embraced, not just tolerated. Let me be clear, I don't mean just like accept the imperfection. I mean literally embraced, welcomed, strategically accounted for, expected as a part of doing it right, when what you're doing is fundamentally an exploratory practice. One in which you're just trying to practice what you want to practice and learn what you want to learn and make what you want to make. I think there's a beauty to embracing the imperfection that's come along with doing it that way. And so again, I've had a smaller yield out of the 125 games that were well received by the outer public, but out of which I've also made some games that the outer public maybe didn't recognize or like, but I liked, and would not have happened if I weren't willing to accept the imperfections as part of making those projects happen. So another place this kind of strategy comes up, and it's why I mentioned, again, it's a fundamental, especially for a learning strategy or exploratory strategy, is if you think back to reading and writing in elementary school, one of the techniques teachers talk about is called guess and go. And it can kind of apply on either side of the spectrum. I think the term gets used different ways in different places. But, it might be used to refer to if you're reading and you get stuck on a word, guess from context and keep going. If you're reading out loud and you see a word, pronounce it the best you can and keep going. If you're trying to write a story and you get stuck to a word that you're not quite sure how to spell, just guess for now and keep going. And it's not because reading and pronouncing things correctly is unimportant. It's not because spelling is unimportant. It's because at the time, you're focused on the higher level activity of taking in what this text is about, if you're reading. Or it's kind of the fundamental higher level activity of planning out, do you have your topic sentences? Do you have your paragraph structure right? Do you have a story you're telling? And that you can't fundamentally be worrying about that. And how do I spell each and every single word? And so you think about the same thing here for our game development sphere. If you're thinking about the higher level activity of, I just want to focus on how do I get this game put together? What are the pieces? Then by embracing the imperfection, this sort of guess and go mentality, you can get a lot more put together as a first pass. You could revisit if it justifies it later, but oftentimes you'll find that just by virtue of, okay, well, you got this thing hanging together and were able to answer the question, is this worth spending more time on? And the answer is often no, and that's fine as long as you didn't sink a massive amount of time into doing it in each and every little part of it, dragging out what could have been a few-week project into a few months, or dragging out what should have been a few-month project into a few years. So that's it for now. Whether you're a beginner, whether you're intermediate, whether you're advanced in doing exploratory work, I encourage you, embrace imperfection, find the beauty in it, appreciate it for what it is, and that it's a dial you can play with when you're trying to balance how you're making what you're making and the ways that you're making it. Because in many cases, unless you are part of a giant team, there's different ways you ought to be doing things. Chris DeLeon for Gamketo. Thank you for tuning in. By the way, if you haven't liked or subscribed, that really means a lot to me. Helps me justify spending a few hours each week on making new YouTube videos, as opposed to all the time going to the podcast and training and the club and Twitter and the other things that I'm doing to try to help developers out there. So anyway, like and subscribe if you haven't yet. Look forward to playing your games in the future, and thanks for tuning in.